Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in this session here at the UNFCCC Pavilion at COP29. This event is called Media Training on Transparency, How to Communicate the ETF and Where to Find Key Information. My name is Jessica Sanchez. I work for the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and it's very, very exciting to have you in today's training, as this is the first time that we do this at COP. Because we want to talk about one of the key aspects of the Paris Agreement, which is transparency. Let me see. I think, yes, here it is. So I would like to share with you the agenda for today. First, in the first section, we will hear from the Secretariat what is exactly transparency under the Paris Agreement, what kind of tools we have, the resources, where can we find information about this process. And then we will hear some stories, hear from communicators and media on their challenges and opportunities they see when communicating climate data and progress. And then we will have a short Q&A for anyone who's interested in having more detailed information. So before we'd like to start, I'd like to invite you to join our media distribution list by scanning this QR code. This list is managed by us, by the Secretariat, and will serve as a direct line to communicate and report on transparency updates, events. It won't be a spam. We will be sure to share really key information with you on announcement initiatives and other key content. So with this in mind, let's begin. So at the heart of today's event, of today's training, lies the Enhanced Transparency Framework, or ETF as we call it. And it is really a cornerstone of the Paris Agreement. There's a small warning that we'd like to make, because we will be covering quite a few acronyms today. But this one is really, it should be on top of your mind, and it's really worth remembering, the ETF, and it's really the reason why we are all here. So 2024 was really quite a year for transparency. It really marked the full implementation of this new system, the ETF, and it was in Glasgow in COP26 that the parties agreed that they needed a timeline and a set of tasks to operationalize this new transparency system. And since then, the UN Climate Change Secretariat has been really working hard on the preparations, on events, on capacity building, and dedicated enormous time and resources to bring parties to be ready for this implementation of this new system called the ETF. And proof of this is how much things have advanced since Glasgow. We have parties that have submitted their first BTRs, that's the second acronym of today. And these BTRs, or new transparency reports, are due to be submitted by the 31st of December this year. And my colleagues here, Stephanie and Federico, they will explain us what they are and why these BTRs are important. Here at COP, we have celebrated 11 parties that have already submitted their BTRs. And this is actually, and why, you might think, why are we celebrating their submission? Well, because they really demonstrate how good climate data and information is really key to drive climate action. We will talk about transparency, because when we talk about transparency, we talk about national benefits. When a party embraces transparency, they are able to build stronger evidence base, identify needs, and set priorities on how to strengthen climate policies over time. When a party embraces transparency, it also sends donors and investors a clear signal about the scale of opportunity and need they have. When also parties embrace transparency, it really provides a better assessment of collective action. When we say that we are on track or we are not on track, is because of data and what we analyze from it. The ETF, as I said, the Enhanced Transparency Framework, it really represents a fundamental element of the Paris Agreement, because without transparency, we'd like to say that you would be navigating a dense forest without a map or a compass. But it's really not about just gathering information. and submitting it and reporting it. It's also about the second process, which is the reviewing, and it's really understanding what this data is about. We had an event 2 days ago where also transparency colleagues were saying that people call the country reports, but actually it's 1 million data points per country. So imagine that amount of information that we have when we talk about transparency. So if there is anything that I would like for you to remember during this training, is that the benefits of transparency, they extend beyond the international climate reporting requirements. It's not just about reporting. Transparency is at the core of the Paris Agreement. It helps assess whether the efforts are enough or we need to have further action. Transparency also shows governments how to make informed decisions, how to design policy responses, how to attract climate finance, how to achieve broader development goals. So transparency is many, many other things and not just the report. And with this introduction, I'd like to now pass the floor to my colleague Stefania, who will kick off this training by sharing insights on transparency contents and tools. Stefania, the floor is yours.
So, welcome all. Welcome to all to the event. Thank you so much for joining. I know this key timing in the COP. Everybody is paying attention for the COP presidency wrap up, but thank you so much for coming here. We want to talk to you about transparency because, as Jessica mentioned, we think it's more than data and it's more than data for data geeks. And we wanted to explain a little bit how information that is being reported by parties can be used and where it's possible to find that information, and how this data that is already there, that parties are putting a lot of effort in preparing the report, and then the secretariat and the experts pay a lot of effort to review this information, can become a source for your news, for your data sharing, for all the communication work that you do. So, going a little bit on transparency, before that we have the Paris Agreement, and the Enhanced Transparency Framework was agreed by parties in Article 13 of the Paris Agreement, and it is, we call it the accountability part. So it's the way that parties report what they are doing, and then the experts review what is this doing, and this helps and makes the Paris Agreement go up in terms of ambition. The information that parties report in their okay, that's better. The information that parties reports in their BTRs, in the Biennial Transparency Report, that's get collectively accounted in the global stocktake, and that let us know where we are and how far away are we with the target, against the target that were set in the Paris Agreement. So it's super important that we pay attention to the information that is reported by the parties in their reports, because it's there. The parties are not hiding, and the process is trying to provide an independent assessment through the review process, through the facilitative multilateral consideration of progress. My colleague Federico will talk about that a little bit more. As Jessica mentioned, we have a lot of acronyms. I'm really sorry about that. We'll try to not to use them that much, but if you take something from this session and it's what are the transparency acronym means, that for me it's a win. So going a little bit further, Jessica mentioned that transparency is not just reporting. Transparency also helps parties to know where they are the gaps, where are the opportunities. This report allows parties to showcase what they are doing well and what they are not doing that well, what are the needs, their gaps they have, how, and also if there are developing country parties, what support they need. And developed countries can also showcase what support they are giving. So there is a lot of information coming in this report that helps national policy making to be very precise and to be based in data, so you can get a very interesting policy that really addresses the problem, and also you can understand from these reports what they are, maybe the gaps that they are missing, and how they can interact with other parties maybe do it better, because with this report, the parties can learn how other parties are doing or tackling climate change, and this sharing of experiences is something that we really promote between parties. So this, I already mentioned that the reports and information reported goes to the GST, and is this bracketing mechanism. So this mechanism of feeding information from parties into the collective global stocktake is a source of information that allows then, when we have the second global stocktake or the third global stocktake, to see, okay, how are we doing? What we did until now? Okay, can we learn from this process what we need to improve, what we would need to do better or not, or stop doing in the next round of NDCs, of BATRs? So having information is maybe the information might not be perfect, might not be complete, but it is better to know where we are standing than know nothing, that go, as Jessica mentioned, in the forest, walking in the dark. Information provide us light to the national circumstances, to the context, to the policies that we are able to implement or not, and how we can do it better in the future. So the Enhanced Transparency Framework has 3 phases. I will focus mostly in the reporting part, will be the biennial transparency report, and then my colleague Federico will talk you a little bit about the review process and the facilitative process. You can put it there. Well, thank you, Jess. So the BTRs. Why I wanted to mention reporting? Because the Enhanced Transparency Framework is the first time in the history of reporting under the convention where parties, both developing and developed, report under the same guidelines. So everybody has to report the same information. Everybody has to report the same type of information and have to follow the same guidelines in terms of what to report, how to report it. This allows comparability. This allows other stakeholders to understand better what parties are doing, because before the Enhanced Transparency Framework, developed countries had one type of guidance, so they were reporting certain type of information, and developing countries were reporting something similar, but not strictly the same. But now, everybody has the same guidelines. Everybody needs to use the same global warming potential, so that allows that emissions are reported in the same, I would say, with the same methodology or in terms of metrics. Metrics are how to explain it plainly. What would you have all the gases, or the GHG gases, and the metrics are the factor that multiplies the gases to turn it into one single unit. And now we only have, every party needs to report using one type of metric. So this improves the transparency of the information, the comparability of the information, and in the end allows to have better clarity of everybody on where we are and what we need to do next. Also, something I wanted to highlight is that the BTRs are going to have a very nice chapter on adaptation, and for the first time parties are going to be allowed to have a voluntary review of the adaptation information. Adaptation information until now was reported in different reports or different places under the convention, but now if parties decide to report it in the BTR, they can also ask the Secretariat to review that information. And the review process, as Federico is going to explain you, allows information to become better and improve over time. So we hope that with this review process of adaptation to information, the adaptation information reported by parties will become better and more transparent and more complete over time. But one important thing to remember is that some parties have been reporting over 20 years and are super experienced, but some others not. They started in 2010 or started in 2014. So I will show you a slide a little bit later on what is the difference. So we have the same guidelines, but the parties agreed on some flexibilities that parties are allowed to take. They are on specific provisions, but that allow us to have the consistent information over time. The whole process is facilitative, and the idea is that parties are able to improve the reporting over time, so as that we have in the future the highest quality of information. But the main point for us is that we have information, that information starts from the basis that they have, and we keep improving over time. The whole process is facilitative, it's not punitive. It doesn't punish parties. We want to have everybody on board. The enhanced transparency framework is supposed to have a universal participation, and we are pushing for that, because if we don't have everybody on the table, if we don't have all parties, all stakeholders on the table, we're missing bits of information, and those gaps we're missing opportunities of mitigate or adapt better. So the idea of the enhanced transparency framework is to bring everybody on the table, considering their national circumstances, considering their national capabilities, and to facilitate that everybody reports better over time. So the process has, as I mentioned, was bifurcated before. We had different process of reporting, review, and experience sharing for developing, but now we have one single track. And we have one single track for reporting, one single track for review, one single track for facilitative sharing of experiences. I think I would like to invite you to actually take a look at the report. Look at the executive summary, at least. I know the reports sometimes are very long, 300 pages, 400 pages, but the executive summary will have the key information. It's what the party wants to highlight. Also, looking at the tables. Now, everybody will have common set of tables. Some of them are mandatory, some of them have flexibility, but in general, the information will be there, so it should be easier for you to look for the data entries, for the information that you are looking to go and report on what is the country that you are, maybe your national, to report how they are doing, and to base the news or the information that you want to share on, okay, they are doing this well. Here we have the information, we have the parties will report the policies and actions, should report, but also they should report the needs. So that's a nice way of getting the context of what the country is doing, and what they can improve in the future. Then one other thing, maybe it's important or might be interesting for you, is what's going to be the structured summary. So the structured summary will provide the progress on the NDC, and one interesting structured summary to take a look at is after the target year of the NDC. So the parties will report the BTR that's going to be after the target year of their NDC. That's where the parties are going to tell everybody that if they have achieved or not their target, and they're going to provide context for that, an explanation of what happened, what didn't go well, what they can do better. All the report also includes sharing of experiences and lessons learned and gaps. So it's a very rich source of information that I know that sometimes can be very technical, but that is why we wanted to have this training for you, so you can help parties also translate this information and make it more accessible to everybody. And I think that starting from the executive summary is a nice point of entry, but also what my colleague is going to share, the review reports. The review reports will tell you what the party did good, what information was missing, so we can also translate this into broader audiences. And lastly, in terms of the flexibility, so parties, the developing country parties that need, in the light of their national circumstances and their capacities, can apply these flexibilities. The flexibility is something important to understand. It's not applicable to all provisions, to all reporting provisions. They are applicable to some specific reporting provisions. And for me, it's a very interesting element that they have to provide what is the capacity constraint behind that provision. Parties are reporting transparently what information they have and what information they don't have, and also with this reporting they should also provide a nationally determined time frame in which they will improve this information over time. So the aim is that we get all parties reporting same type of report with all information, with all the same quality, but we will get there over time. And the idea is that we don't lose anybody in the process, that we facilitate improvement of reporting over time. And for that, I think that the media have a really big role to play to help parties to translate and to communicate the information better. They are putting a lot of effort in preparing these reports, and I think that sometimes I used to be a party, and we get lost in the details. But having a feedback on how to communicate this better, what would be more interesting or more, what we need to be more translated into more accessible language to broader audiences, is something that you can communicate and can share as a feedback. And I think usually parties appreciate that, because if they are doing a lot of effort in adapt or mitigate to climate change, they want to showcase what they did. If they do it in a very abstract way, they lose a lot of impact. So there's a really important role for media and communicators to support parties to enhance this understanding of transparency and information better. So with that, I'll give the floor to Federico, who will give you more information on the review part.
Thank you very much, Jessica and Stefania, for introducing this training and going through the first part of the presentation. My name is Federico. I work in the UNSCC Secretariat as well, in the Transparency Division. So let me start by saying we are aware this is a lot of information to digest. There's a lot of technical details, a lot of information that probably you may have not heard before, or you may have heard before in a more overarching way. And before getting to the details of the review part, I would like just to start by saying something about the approach for what we are discussing today. I myself am not a journalist. In the past, I was in the position of having to write reports or articles for my previous jobs. And I assume that many of you may have found themselves in a position to write an article or write a piece or any sort of report describing what parties are doing. And I think one question that you may have struggled with at some point is, where do I find information I can trust? Where do I find information about emissions of this party that I can rely on? Where can I find information on the status of implementation of the party's targets? And this is really what we are trying to convey today. Today, we are showing how, under the Paris Agreement, we do indeed have a system in place that provides regularly this kind of information that you can use. What Stefania presented so far is essentially the structure of the Enhanced Transparency Framework and the reporting component. So as you may have seen in one of the previous slides, we have these three components: the reporting side, the review side, and then the facilitative consideration of progress. Essentially, the reporting side is what will give you the information. From the submission of BTR, you will find the details that you need. But to answer the second part of the question, where can I find information I can trust? On top of what parties report, these reports are then subject to this technical expert review. And the review is conducted by experts, nominated by countries, that perform an independent assessment of the information reported by parties. So you have two kind of documents that you can rely and consider. First, the report submitted by parties, the BTR. And then on the other side, you will have the review reports of these submissions, where experts independently will have made an assessment of what is fully adhering to the reporting guidelines, which information was missing, as Stefania mentioned, and what could be improved in the future reports. So this is what we are going to discuss today very briefly, the information that is subject to review. What is that the independent experts will assess when going through the BTRs? And this really covers the real bulk of climate action and support. information that is part of the review from the BTR includes the greenhouse gas inventories, so all information about emission levels by parties. Information to track progress made in the implementation and achievement of the NDC. So you will find in the BTR, in the so-called structured summary that Stefania was mentioning, really the information on where the party is at in terms of progressing towards its target. Lastly, information on support provided to developing countries, support that is financial, support that is technical, in terms of capacity building, and so forth. And finally, the part on climate change impacts and adaptation that will kick off soon, where parties that wish to have that information reviewed will also have an opportunity to get insights from the experts. And the reason why we say getting an insight from experts is that the review process, as it was mentioned already, is not a punitive process for parties. It is a process that we often refer to as a capacity building for the country. Because thanks to the independent assessment by experts, countries will have an opportunity to understand how they can do better next time. What are the areas where there's some gaps in the methodologies, in the institutional arrangements, etc. All this information will be extremely relevant for you in informing your work in writing and reporting about this process, about where parties are at the collective level and at the national level. So, moving forward, after the review process, there is the last component, the third one. It's a very long acronym. It's FMCP, that stands for Facilitative Multilateral Consideration of Progress. So what does it mean? It means that it's a public forum that actually takes place at COP or at the SB session in June in Bonn, where parties, after participating in the review process, also have an opportunity to share in an open space where other parties and observers can attend and learn about what are the parties' latest insights on their climate policies. What are the lessons that they've learned from the review process? And that's usually an opportunity also to receive questions from other parties. This is not going to be a new process. It's just the evolution under the Paris Agreement of processes that already exist under the Convention. A few days ago, actually, a very similar process under the Convention, which at the moment is bifurcated for Annex 1 parties and non-Annex 1 parties, took place right here in Baku. These two sessions were called Multilateral Assessment for Annex 1 parties and Facilitative Sharing of Views for developing countries. So as you can see, this new acronym really brings together these two processes into one, but we will build upon the experiences made up until now. And just to show you one example, some parties were presenting about their climate action, their institutional arrangements, and in some of these sessions, other parties came in and said, look, this information that you just shared about involving 20 ministries in your country in the preparation of the BTR is extremely interesting. Can you share more about how you made the institutional arrangements to ensure that this information flows flawless and constantly over time? So it's an opportunity for parties to share, and it's also an opportunity for other parties to hear and learn what they can also improve at a national level. And it's also an opportunity for observers, journalists, media to understand what countries are doing. So this process overall really gives you an opportunity to understand what parties are doing and to have reliable information, information that you can trust in writing your pieces. Coming to the end, you may also be struggling with a question, all right, I may find the information about the individual countries, so the BTRs will be submitted by each party, but how do I put this information together? How can I have a sense of what the world is at? Because, you know, NDCs are very different. Some parties have submitted NDC with certain target types, other parties have different ones, different indicators. So it's not so easy to put them together and to have the overall effect. And for that, there will be a new product that is going to be available, that is the BTR Compilation and Synthesis Report. So this is going to be a document that will really provide evidence on collective progress of parties. And you may also be wondering at this point, but then I may have heard already something about this. What about the global stocktake? wasn't that the process that was going indeed to provide a picture, a snapshot of the global progress? Indeed it is. And the processes are strictly interlinked, as you can see here. So essentially, the ETF and the Enhanced Transparency Framework is probably the least famous of these three processes that you can see here. I'm pretty sure that every one of you is familiar with the NDCs, and every one of you is familiar with the global stocktake. But not as many of you may be familiar with the details of the ETF. Actually, all of these three processes are strictly interlinked. How? The ETF provides the information. So through the ETF, parties will tell the world what they are doing. This information is going to be reviewed under the ETF, as we have just discussed, and shared with the world under the third component of the FMCP. And all this information is actually one of the major sources of input of the global stocktake process. So every 5 years, the global stocktake will consider the compilation and synthesis of all this information. And the result, the outcome of the global stocktake, will be to inform the need for the world to enhance global ambition. How? Through new rounds of NDCs, which is exactly what is going to happen in a few months with NDC 3.0. And from there, the process will start again, because in the next reports, the next BTRs, parties will report on their progress on their new NDCs, and so forth, and so forth. So this is really a narrative that we would like to encourage you to communicate, that it's not just about the collective progress at the global level through the GST. It's not just about the NDCs. It's also about reporting and review this information. And it is really a single process. And with that, I think we'll move to the next phase of our event. So I'm very happy to hand the floor over to Jessica again to kick off our panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. Thank you, Steffi. I think we're very lucky to have them because they are really colleagues who understand also what the challenges are when communicating this topic. Before we move to the panel, I'd like to remind some of the key messages here. Transparency, it is a source for communicators, for creators, for journalists, for anyone that would like to communicate on climate action and climate progress. We also want you to understand and to really remember that transparency is about sharing experiences. When parties say we have this gap or we could improve in this, it is really a collaborative process. Also, it's good to remember that we have now the same, or we will be having the same guidelines. So maybe when you read the first BTR or the first executive summary, this will be the first time that you do so, but then you will be having the same kind of reports, and it will be also easier for communicators. We also heard that transparency is a journey, so we don't expect the first reports to be perfect. The contrary, if they are perfect the first time, then why should they submit the second time? So we know that transparency is a journey, and that's what we want, that every time, every year, the transparency reports are better. It's not a punitive process, as my colleague said. It's not naming and shaming. It's about what we can do together and how can we improve. Also, Federico shed a light on the big risk that communicators face, because we live in the disinformation and misinformation era, and we need to be careful. Where do we get information from? What kind of information are we using to report stories and to really educate audiences? And when we talk about climate progress, it's very important to have a trusted source. So these reports will be your trusted source of information. Also, the reports that are being reviewed by experts, and how these reports, they will also shed a light on how these reports will become better over time. And I would like to finalize by saying that now that you have seen that these systems are being unified, it's not really about simplifying the systems, it's really harmonizing the process. And I think transparency, as you will see, we have been, this year marked a very important year for transparency professionals and transparency communicators. 2024 was a big year. I think 2025 will be also a very important year for communicators, because we will have now the sources so that we can report on what transparency and what each party is doing. So with that in mind, I would like to thank my two colleagues, and we will move to the second session of this training. Thank you. So now I will invite to the stage Jennifer Bansard. She is a team leader from Earth Negotiations Bulletin. And we also have Disen Billy. She is the Caribbean Regional Director of Climate Tracker. And last but not least, we have Nathan Coxwell, Research Associate from International Climate Action Climate Program from the World Resources Institute. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Jennifer, I'd like to start with you because you have been following transparency, if not like a particular topic, you have been following transparency for the work that you do. Could you explain to us what do you do and why transparency is important for your work?
Sure. Does this work? Yes. Yeah, thanks for having us. So I'm here from the Earth Negotiations Bulletin. We provide coverage on the climate change negotiations and many other environmental negotiations. We actually deliver two types of products. We have these very technical summaries of what's happening in the negotiations. So there we are thinking about the audience in the negotiations, so the country parties. But we also write daily reports for broader audiences. And that's the key message for us. It's to think about what kind of audience you're writing to when you try to convey information about transparency, about what's happening in the climate process, and why different things that are being addressed in the negotiations matter for the real world.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Disen, I think I would like to ask you the same question. What does transparency mean to your work?
Hi everyone, sorry my voice is a little bit sore today. My name is Dizan, I'm from Climate Tracker, and what we do is we help to train journalists to understand how to report on the COP process and on the climate crisis, and transparency of course is very important for that. For us it's important for our journalists to understand how to, not just how to access and source data to support their stories, but also how to make that understandable for the people on the ground, because one of the things that we always drive home to them is the importance of humanizing the story so that, you know, people can connect with it on the ground. So as much as possible that they can take the data and make it, you know, make sense for people back home is what is really important for us. And this information is very critical to help support their stories in that sort of way.
Thank you. Nathan, why do you think transparency, I mean, you come from the World Resources Institute, so resources is your thing. Why do you think transparency is important for your work? And you have already covered some of the transparency work. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the question, and thanks for having me. The thing I think about transparency is that it helps us tell the stories we want to tell, or the stories we need to tell about climate change, about progress made in addressing climate change. And I think there's this really important nuance that's important as well when thinking about the stories around transparency, is that transparency tells us there are two stories. We're making progress. We are seeing countries, parties taking efforts, implementing actions in response to their NDCs. But we also see that that is not enough to address the climate crisis, the projections of where current NDCs take us and the trajectories they put us on in terms of warming or the impacts of climate change. And so for me, transparency is about the stories, is about the pieces we pull out from what we are doing, from what our governments are doing, from what communities are doing, the impacts of climate change on those communities, on those governments. And so for me, that's the importance of transparency. I'm a data nerd. I love the data elements. I love the small nuances in the 400 pages of the BTR. But I think ultimately what that comes out to is really compelling stories. And those are the stories that this process, that the UNFCCC process, that the reporting really can bring to the rest of the global community as well.
Thank you so much for the three answers that you have given us. I think it's worth highlighting the need to choose the right audience, to also humanize these stories, because data is difficult to understand if you're not in the field, and we should also be reporting for those who are not in the field. And Nathan, I love the fact that you say data nerd, but I hope we can become more popular, as Federico said, because this is 1/3 of the process, and it will be important to do so. And then now I would like to go to the kind of negative side. What are the challenges that you have been facing when communicating data and information and transparency?
I think for us a big challenge was the balance between being very accurate about terminology in the process and developments in the process. I sat through the negotiations for the common tabular formats of this reporting. This was endless. We were talking about, should it be a pull-down menu, a yes or no box? And it's always hard to keep accurate with all these details, but then also find a way to make clear, why does it matter? Why does it matter if there's a box where you can add information on adaptation? Why does it matter if you can report on loss and damage related needs to some countries? And so I think that's a struggle. You've mentioned all the acronyms in the process. That's another big one, right? So when I'm talking about choosing your audience, it also influences exactly how are you speaking about things, because for some audiences, a certain level of detail will be essential, and for others, it's better to keep it broader.
Yeah, so for one of the major challenges for us, I think, has been being able to creatively bridge the gap between the technical knowledge and what people on the ground really want to know. Because for us, as well, for journalists, it's very important that our readers can connect with the story, our viewers can connect with what's going on the ground here and understand how it impacts their lives. So at the end of the day, it's very important for us to be able to bridge that gap, and that has been one of the challenges, I think. But also accessibility of data that, I'll speak from the Caribbean perspective. For instance, accessibility of data that reflects the Caribbean accurately has been quite challenging, because oftentimes we get sort of lumped into Latin America and the Caribbean, and the data doesn't really reflect what's going on the islands specifically. So for our journalists, that has been another major challenge.
And just to pick up on Jennifer's point around the audience, I think different users of different audiences are going to take very different things away from data. And thinking about how that data is presented really matters. And so for some are going to want to download an Excel file. Some are going to want to download raw data, be able to play with it, to make their own calculations. Maybe they're academics, maybe they're researchers, and that is really important for them. But for others, it's about summary data. It's about a summary chart, a quick dashboard on progress. And so certainly I think a challenge is being clear about the audience you're communicating to and what that audience might take away from the data you're presenting, but also then ensuring that you have the right data to support that presentation, right? And so a summary dashboard on progress made in implementing or achieving NDCs, you have to have the right data, pull the right data from the BTR in order to accurately reflect that progress in that summary, for example. And so certainly I think that one of the challenges, but I think also an important element for communicators to think up through is that question of audience. Think about how do you take the data that's nuanced and relevant to the local community, to a particular party, to a particular region, and then present that in a way that the audience will take away the insights you want them to have.
I think that's really interesting, because indeed audiences are different. Not only their their political context and where they are based, or global north, global south, but also what kind of information, how do they consume information, and how do they retain also what we want them to understand. Jennifer, you said we can't simplify information, yet at the same time we also need to make it attractive and digestible, and how can we find that sweet spot that Design was talking about. How can we make logic and magic come in the same room? And talking about that, when you communicate transparency, what kind of resources and tools do you usually use? Where do you get the information? How can you start the reporting of transparency?
Yeah, so like many other people in this room, I'm one of those nerds that actually reads all of those reports. So definitely, you mentioned in your presentation the synthesis reports, right? For any issue that we address in the negotiation, the synthesis reports that the secretaries provide are essential. Sometimes it takes longer than others to dig for the actual numbers and figures that you want to highlight in there. We know that in some cases, sometimes reports by constituted bodies, there's even struggles about what to elevate to the executive summary level, because that is already a filtering of information. So depending on what you're looking for, you might have to sit through the 60 plus pages and find the information there. But I think that where the Secretariat may be constrained in what they present and elevate, different types of news outlets and think tanks are freer in what they highlight, and so we can go down to the nitty-gritty and pick out an angle that might illuminate something specific that responds to a current discussion, for example. And so you can tie information from the very technical BTRs, for example, to, I don't know, a specific type of weather event that has been happening, or a recent policy development, or the World Bank providing support for a specific type of intervention on transportation. So I think that's one of the advantages of having more freedom to choose the angle of what to elevate.
Yeah, for us on our side, I think one thing we've been trying to do is host or include more tailored workshops for our journalists that share the information that they need directly on a local perspective, and share with them exactly how to understand the BTR, the ETF. It's all so technical when you're coming from it with a limited understanding of the process, because a lot of the journalists that we work with as well, they're new to this space, they're new to understanding the UNFCCC process. So for us, it's really understanding how we can take transparency as one of the elements, one of the pervasive elements of it all, and include it in our tailored workshops for our journalists.
And from my perspective, I think there are sort of two ways I was thinking about this question in terms of how do you start reporting on transparency. And I think one is obviously this question, I have a story I want to tell, I can use the BTRs, I can use the transparency reports as a source of information to tell that story. So I'm working in country X, and I want to tell the story of their NDC, or I want to tell their story of their efforts on adaptation, or I want to tell the story of the financial support received. And so in those cases, the BTRs, the transparency reports have a lot of information that you can turn to. Estefania and Federico talked about the reporting and ensuring, and the review processes to ensuring that that data is of high quality and is reviewed, and noting the comments of experts. And so I think that's one way to think about telling these stories, is if you have an idea, the BTRs are there as a source of reference. For me, the other approach is starting with the BTRs, is starting with the data source. And I hate to recommend people read the reporting guidelines, but I think, at least from my experience and my familiarity with the reporting guidelines, I know there are already pieces that parties will be reporting on, and I'm excited to read 20 reports to see what the commonalities are across those reports. What are the differences? Where are the differences in institutional structures in terms of pulling together climate action? What are those similarities? What are those differences across parties? Where can lessons be learned from the reports in terms of applying that to engagement with communities, etc. And so for me, I think there's these two different ways that the BTRs can be a helpful source for reporting, either as a source of data, but also a source of inspiration from which you can build a story based on the data that will be reported.
Thank you all for sharing your tips and what you have learned reporting or making stories on transparency. And I would also like to use this room because we have here a room full of communicators. What type of resources they can use from each and one of your organizations? This is a moment to make some announcements or share any publication that you have announced this COP.
Yes, thanks for this opportunity. So in case you don't know about the work of the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, we provide all the insights about the technical developments of negotiations on transparency, on compliance, on a lot of those issues. You can find our analyses of the overall result of the conference 2 days after its closing, of which I'm not going to say a date. We provide these more accessible reporting on a daily basis, and so we try and highlight some of the big discussions in there. We also have different types of things such as a glossary on the climate change negotiations. So we have different types of projects that you can see on the Earth Negotiations Bulletin website to help you in your work.
Yeah, thank you so much, and it's so useful. We use it all the time. For us, our team of journalists, we have a team of journalists, young journalists from Latin America and the Caribbean here, three representing the Caribbean and 3 representing Latin America. And you can find their stories on our website, climatetrackercaribbean.org and climatetrackerlatam.org. Yes, I think that's it. And they're reporting stories directly from a national perspective, and what is important for their country specifically at this COP. So I would encourage you to check out their stories. We also do a newsletter every other day as well, kind of showing their stories, but also what is important for these developing countries that they represent. So please check it out.
Thank you, and I would just highlight two resources, online resources that we publish and maintain that I think can be useful. The first is called Climate Watch, climatewatchdata.org, which contains a lot of detail and data about climate action, lists the indices from parties, pulls out some key elements around the indices, the targets, the different sectors parties mention in their indices, tracks the latest indices as they come, but also tracks the latest long-term low emissions development strategies. So it can be a resource for checking on a lot of these political commitments parties have made, where we've tried to pull all of that together in one place for users. And the second tool I would mention is a platform we publish called the Systems Change Lab, which includes dashboards and indicators towards a lot of the big systems changes we need to see to reach 1.5. So what are the systems change we need to see in the power sector or the transport sector? What are the data points that can help us know whether we're on track towards these big systems changes? And so there's a lot of very interesting data there for folks to explore. So I would recommend those two. Thanks.
Great. I think we all have some homework to do when we go out of this session. So I would like to open the floor to anyone that would like to ask any question to the panel. Do I see a hand? No, I think all clear. Okay. Oh, I have a hand here.
Thank you so much. My name is Toshi Sakamoto from Japan. I'm not from media, but from a think tank dealing with this kind of information. I have a question to Federico, if I may. You showed the one slide pie chart equally split among ETF, GST, and NDC. But there was nothing about the long-term strategy. The parties are encouraged to submit a long-term strategy as well. It's not shall, but should, if my memory is correct. I think why the scope of ETF doesn't include a long-term strategy. If it includes, maybe some parties NDCs is not consistent with its long-term strategy. So such kind of aspect should be reviewed, could be reviewed in ETF.
Thank you very much for the question. I will just stand up just to avoid giving you my back. So let's start by saying this. The scope of the enhanced transparency framework was negotiated by parties. So in particular, it was, I think, at Katowice COP24 when parties agreed the bulk of the reporting requirements for the BTR. And in that occasion, the agreed structure for the main chapters was to have information on greenhouse gas inventories, information on tracking progress of NDCs, climate change impacts and adaptation, and then financial technology transfer and capacity building support. That being said, within the chapter on information to track progress on NDCs, there are different subchapters. One dealing with policies and measures, one dealing with projections, and so forth. Within the policies and measures, parties are actually required to report their policies that they're planning not only in the next 10 years, but also in the longer term. So parties have an opportunity in these sections to indicate in case they have a national long-term strategy, for instance. So it may not be labeled or framed as prominently as it is the NDC, but in the BTR, parties have an opportunity to indicate any long-term strategy or mitigation action that they may have at the national level. So that is definitely an opportunity to find information about this. I hope this addresses your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have another question? No? Okay, I have a question. I was thinking now that we have been talking about the long-term perspectives and long-term strategies, and I wanted to also maybe hear your perspective on the future. What do you envision or hope or you are working towards for next year on transparency stories, especially with COP30 being in Brazil? There's a strong focus on creating new stories, on creating new narratives. So what do you envision for the future on transparency stories?
I, for my part, think that BTOs will help in bridging certain gaps in understanding between developed countries and developing countries. If I look back on discussions we had on ex-ante climate finance provision, right? So where providers of finance are supposed to announce ahead of time their intention of providing certain levels of finance and focus areas, for example. We have these discussions of developing countries then explaining, okay, this was helpful, that actually didn't help me much. I would need this to provide some planning clarity, for example, and those discussions were really helpful, and I think we will have more of those once we have more BTRs coming in.
Yeah, first I think that it's going to be very important to form more collaborative relationships with the UNFCCC, because I believe that if we can in some way have more direct training, with the representatives of the UNFCCC for journalists, it's going to be very important. For instance, I don't know if you're aware, but Guyana is the first developing country to submit their BTR, and that's amazing. So one of our journalists is from Guyana. She wrote about a story about that. And I can see more. I know that, the island nations, they always are, campaigning to raise ambition, and I can see that over the next couple months I'm looking forward to more more of that happening, more of those stories coming out, just to show that we're not just, we're not just talking the talk, but we're walking the walk. So I'm just looking forward to those stories coming out to show what really have at their priorities.
On what Disen said, I would like to read the list of BTRs that we have now, just in case you are reporting stories on these countries. And we celebrate them on 2 events here at COP, and we are very happy that they are front runners for the BTRs. We're calling them the BTR champions. So the list is Panama, Guyana, Andorra, Japan, Turkey, Germany, Spain, Kazakhstan, the Netherlands, Singapore, and Maldives. So if you are reporting stories on these countries, I recommend you to already look on the website of the Secretariat, the BTRs. They are already published. And then my future question to you, Nathan.
And some of those BTRs have come during the COP, which means I have not had a chance to look at them yet, which is top of the to-do list when I get back home. But I think it's a great point around the islands and the reporting, because the reporting is at the discretion for least developed countries and SIDS. And so we've certainly seen many of these parties show great leadership in this process and are taking a lot of significant steps domestically to address climate change. And so great to see their leadership through the BTRs as well, especially when it's the reporting is at their discretion. So I think that's an important story. I think the reporting of BTRs also itself is a story. This is an important process for a lot of developing countries. It represents quite a significant step up in their obligations in terms of what they have to present to the international community. And so the ability of those parties to report in a timely manner, to share their willingness to start that learning by doing journey, right? Recognizing that their report isn't going to be perfect this first time, but that they will build that capacity, they will enhance that reporting over time, I think is also a very important story, and one that is of a lot of interest to me. And then just the last story I'm really looking forward to, and I mentioned this earlier, is what are the lessons that are hidden in those 400 pages and those 200 pages that we can pull out from across 190 some parties, across the 100 and some BTRs we'll have by December, by January, February. What are those overarching challenges and stories of success that will take a little bit of digging to find, but are really, I think, going to speak to this moment and to speak to how parties are addressing climate change.
Thank you all. And as we mentioned, this COP we celebrated the BTR champions. And I hope next year we can celebrate the ETF communicators. So we will be looking for your stories, for your reports, for different kind of formats, as we mentioned in this session, whether it's an Excel sheet or a story on an island, or maybe another story that also sheds light on a more human story as well. So thank you for reading the BTRs, for the reports, for your hard work, and thank you also for being here in this first training on transparency. And I please ask you a round of applause for my panelists.